In the background, you'll see my ongoing BMW R60/5 restoration, a project with plenty of reasons to keep me busy, but recently a rare opportunity came up locally that I just couldn't pass on, a 1951 BMW R25 motorcycle. In this video, I will bring this old relic back to life, giving it the care it deserves. This BMW R25 is one of the very first in the R25 series produced between 1950 and 1951. Originally, this motorcycle was purchased by a dealer named Ottomente in Hanover to be displayed in his showroom and offered for sale. At the time, with the world facing post-war economic challenges, affordability and practicality were essential. That's why this bike received a single-cylinder, 4-stroke, 250cc engine, producing a total of 12 horsepower at 5600 RPM. These motorcycles were used daily, often as primary vehicles, making high-mileage examples like mine with over 91,000 kilometers quite common. Now, speaking of the drivetrain, the engine power was transferred through a single-disc dry clutch to a 4-speed gearbox, which was removed by the previous owner. Not to worry, the gearbox came with the bike. With this, we'll be able to assemble the bike, but firstly, let's start by removing the old 6-volt battery. Yes, you heard that right, 6 volts, which was common back in the day, but not so much today. Out goes the battery along with the custom battery tray. From what I've been told, the previous owner last ran this bike 12 years ago, but a clutch-related issue led to the gearbox removal. You can see the square center of the pressure plate and the loose friction disc spline. I'll need to center these up as they are misaligned. Using a 3D printed sleeve on the clutch pushrod, I can align the friction disc to the pressure plate's square center. It actually works pretty well. Once aligned, I just need to fasten the original clutch bolts, keeping everything steady. Pretty straightforward actually. Now for the gearbox install, I'm removing the rear wheel, though I later realized this wasn't necessary. The drive spline, wheel bearings, and braking surface all features that would still be used in motorcycles 20 years after this one. Very cool in my opinion. I also removed the final drive and drive shaft to install the gearbox, as the drive shaft isn't telescoping. With the gearbox aligned to the engine, the clutch pushrod is now in place within the gearbox. Attempting to install it later wouldn't be an option. Along with the gearbox were a few miscellaneous parts in a box, but some were also missing, so I ordered a few new parts. The clutch actuation linkage is linked to a bracket, and that is then attached with a pin to the gearbox. This assembly is all adjustable thanks to a set screw and a nut. As you can tell, to the left of the handlebar, the clutch perch was missing completely. Luckily, aftermarket versions are available, but in my honest opinion, they are junk, and they are really expensive as well. Either way, we're going to make it work. Once on the handlebar, it's time to install the clutch cable and tighten the clutch lever. Here, the clutch actuation works, but I'm really not pleased with the clutch perch. It just feels cheap and I would not feel good about using it on a short trip. I might have to make something myself in the near future. To finish up the gearbox, the speedometer drive gear needed to be purchased and installed. This little gear will drive the speedometer cable, giving us feedback on the motorcycle's speed. It's important to keep all components lubed during the assembly for easier fitment. Now the Hardy disc will be installed onto the gearbox output flange. This is essentially a flexible rubber coupling between the gearbox flange and the drive shaft. It dampens the vibrations and shocks that are transferred through the drivetrain to the rear end. After that, the final drive and rear wheel went back on, just keeping in mind to connect everything to the drivetrain. Luckily, battery trays are still available, so in goes a new one along with a new, correct-sized 6-volt battery. I was told these are prone to failure, so we'll see how well it holds up. With the battery hooked up, we can test the ignition switch, and it looks like we have some lights. Now that's promising. Next, let's check the oil level. We'll need a 22mm wrench to loosen the dipstick cap. The dipstick is threaded directly into the aluminum engine block, and it can only be accessed with a wrench. From what I can tell, the oil looks brand new, so it seems the previous owner recently changed it. Now let's see if the oil pump distributes oil internally before we attempt to start it. Behind the flat cover is the oil pump shaft, driven by the camshaft. These caps are often extremely tight, likely because they haven't been removed since the bike left the factory around 70 years ago. I have a special tool to open it, but the cap is really stuck on there. It seems somebody already tried to open the cap, damaging the groove. Applying heat near this area is risky because the cap sits close to the rear radial bearing of the camshaft. Excessive heat could damage the bearing, so I'm using a heat gun cautiously. When that didn't work, I decided to widen the slot to fit a custom tool with a tighter grip. Using a Dremel with a cutoff disc, I created a wider groove to fit a washer as my custom tool. With a bit more heat, the cap finally came loose, but I'll admit it was really tight on there. Now I'll remove the oil pump shaft to install a custom hand tool I made. It mimics the original shaft, but it's 2 inches longer so I can manually drive the oil pump. To confirm oil flow through the engine, I'll remove the valve covers to check if oil reaches the rocker arms. The rocker arms are the last point oil flows to before returning into the oil pan within this engine. I'll turn the shaft by hand, focusing on the rocker arms. Here you can see a small amount of oil starting to come out. This confirms we definitely have oil flow throughout the engine. Now that that's done, we'll check for spark by removing the spark plug. While it's out, we can use a bore scope to take a look inside the cylinder. Everything seems to be relatively fine considering this engine is 74 years old. There's some excess carbon buildup, but that's typical. I gave the spark plug a quick clean, and now we'll test for spark. Looks like we have a decent spark, and I haven't even touched the electrical components. Just look at them. Next, let's check the compression to see if we can get the full 12 horsepower from this little engine when it's running. After a few kicks, I notice we're barely getting any compression, only around 50 psi. To confirm that the piston rings are still sealing, I'll add a bit of oil into the cylinder. This will tell us if the rings are worn or if there's a problem with the cylinder head. After a few more kicks, it seems the issue is within the cylinder head. Now I'll remove the carburetor and the exhaust pipe to get to the cylinder head. Thankfully these came loose as the threads on the exhaust are often seized to the aluminum cylinder head. Next I'll remove the rocker arms and the cylinder head studs. The cylinder head was stuck onto the sealing surface, so I tapped it gently with a block of wood and a hammer, being careful not to damage the aluminum cooling fins. I took the cylinder head to the bench and removed the valves along with the corresponding components. This revealed an oddly shaped bronze valve guide on the intake side. Now for the exhaust side. Here we have even more problems. The valve is extremely loose in the valve guide, meaning it's not centered or properly guided to the valve seats. On top of that, the valve guide is loose. I could remove it by hand, which means this part of the cylinder head wasn't sealing at all. This cylinder head needs a complete overhaul before we can get the R25 up and running again. Now I'll send this out to the machine shop, and in the meantime I'll clean up the carbon deposits from the piston with a scraper and some steel wool. It looks like this engine has had some work done to it in the past with an oversized piston installed. Originally the piston would have been a 67.94mm size in the original bore. This one, however, is already 1mm oversized and dates back to March of 1954. Very interesting. I'll also rebuild the Bing carburetor while we wait for the cylinder head. I'm removing all internal parts and inspecting their condition. It still has the original brass Bing float, which is in perfect condition. Pretty cool to see. Replacement parts are available, but I refurbish as many of the original parts as possible. I'll be sharing 2 short videos of the Bing carburetor disassembly and assembly very soon, so stay tuned for that. A few days later, the cylinder head returned from the machine shop with new bronze valve guides and valve seats. This was a bit overkill for such a low compression engine, but I hope this bike lasts for many more years. All other cylinder head components were also replaced, like new valves, springs, valve spring caps, and the keepers. With the top end ready to be installed, I'm lubricating all parts before the assembly. A new head gasket goes on between the cylinder and the cylinder head. First the push rods go in, followed by the cylinder head studs. To improve access, I removed the fuel tank. This gives me better reach when torquing down the studs. Shout out to Precise Built for hooking me up with a new torque wrench. Next, it's time to set the push rods to the correct height so they're level. This ensures the cam followers are positioned on the heel or the low point of the cam lobe. I can set this by turning the engine over by hand with the kickstarter. Now it's time to reinstall the rocker arms and adjust the end play by bringing the support blocks together with a clamp. I'm leaving just enough clearance for the rocker arm to pivot freely. Then I use the Guten-Tight method to secure the rocker arm nuts. The valve lash is set to 8 thousandths of an inch on the exhaust side and 6 thousandths of an inch on the intake side. The exhaust nut goes back on with the new crush washer between the sealing surfaces, and I added a bit of copper paste to the threads. This way it will not seize up on me. The carburetor and fuel tank are reinstalled, and now it's time to fuel it up. Ignition on and start kicking. By the 8th kick, it sounded way more promising, so hopefully it starts here very soon. It sounds better, but it needs a little bit more fuel. I gave it 2 more squirts of fuel by pressing down the carburetor tickler. This manually introduces fuel into the carburetor mixing chamber. Well, that right there was the first startup. Took a little bit longer to start than I initially expected it to, but seems to be running pretty good. I did not adjust the carburetor whatsoever, so there's still adjustments to be made. And all I was waiting for was a nice day to take it out for its first little ride up and down a gravel road, since it's nowhere near being roadworthy yet. Here we go. If you enjoyed this BMW R25 revival video, feel free to let me know down below in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.